Hi, Tristan. How are
Hi,
you?
Michelle. I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's good to see you.
You too.
Thank you so much for saying yes to this conversation about grief and COVID-19 and all that is going on right now
Yeah.
in our
Thank you for
world.
having it.
So I wonder if you would share about who you are and what you do in the world.
Sure. I started my own business a couple years ago, mainly working with yoga teachers and healers. I do marketing and business consulting, web and graphic design. And I'm currently slowly now with the current circumstances pursuing training to offer race equity facilitation for my clients. I had enrolled in several in-person trainings this year that are now being postponed. So that is hopefully going to be more and more a part of my work.
That is awesome. We work together and I didn't know that. So that's exciting.
I mean, one of the trainings is yours with Carrie Kelly, of course. But then, yes, I was enrolled in one through Resolutions Northwest and then with Angelina Vasili here in Portland. And it just feels like that's a natural progression. When I started my business, I said, how do I still incorporate social justice work and values into supporting yoga teachers? And it just felt like at the time I couldn't see how the two intersected, which was actually like right before I read your book originally. I mean, I saw how yoga and social justice intersected, but I didn't see how it would intersect in my work. Mm-hmm. And then that's just kind of evolved organically, and it feels like a really obviously much needed service right now. And being able to name, especially in conversations, and this is related to our topic and also sidetracking, right? But especially in conversations around trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive yoga. And I'm working with lots of people who are, white, cis women. And if we're talking about trauma-informed yoga and not talking about things like race and identity, then we're missing key components of that conversation. And I want to be able to highlight that and name that and educate and interrupt. And I feel like I need more skills to offer that in my work. So that's part of what I'm pursuing.
I'm so excited about this extension or expansion of your work and path. And I want to come back to it a little later I have a question about what is happening now and how we're experiencing it in different ways. But I wanted to just check in and see how your heart is feeling, how you are doing, given the world we're in right now and what has shifted for all of us.
Yeah. Day to day, I feel, especially recently, like now that I've kind of acclimated, I feel often good and like very clear and grounded and even happy. But when someone asks me how my heart is, I feel something else emerge. And this happens a lot when I sit for meditation, just like so much sadness and weight. And I feel a lot of inner confusion and conflict around the ability to experience joy and how fortunate I am and how resourced I am, and to know that that's not available right now for everyone. And so to hold space for my own grief, it gets a little complicated. I almost want to cut myself off sometimes from feeling my sadness because I'm aware of my privilege and how fortunate I am. And so there's a lot of both and emerging, but yeah, to simply answer how my heart is, it's often heavy and sad. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And also light. So it's both. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, what you said resonates with me, and that there's just like the collective heart is heavy right now, and where we can, if we can feel the lightness or something brings us joy or something other than deep grief or in addition to deep grief, right? Because we can hold both of them, but it's important to allow that to happen, I think. Yeah. So how are you? I know you described like sort of wanting to shut off. I don't know if that's actually your desire. I think you're describing what's happening behaviorally, may not actually be your desire from the grief because it's heavy. And I'm wondering how you are making space for yourself to grieve as this pandemic is unfolding moment to moment?
I mentioned my meditation practice. That has been really a huge component of how I'm like actually give myself space to feel. I do a lot of crying often these days when I'm sitting in silence, which isn't something that emerges often for me, but it is lately. And it's, I'm trying to be gentle with myself. Like if I wake up late and I don't get to sit first thing in the morning because the dog needs to go outside, like that's okay too. But being dedicated to sitting for a period of time feels like a big part of how I'm creating space. And moving my body has been enormously helpful. The first week and a half or two of being in quarantine, I was reluctant to do a lot of movement. I almost wanted to stay stuck, and it felt like I had to get over the hurdle of not going to practice with other people and to not be in group environment and to do it at home. And there's a whole complex history for me around over exercising at home by myself. And so I think, inwardly fighting against that a little bit. Like, can I trust myself to do this in a healthy way, in a supportive way, and not lean into self-destructive, tendencies? Mm-hmm. But once I started moving again at home on my mat and doing like home workout stuff, I felt myself be able to process and shift what was coming up for me emotionally a lot more thoroughly, successfully. Having that energetic like shift is just so important for me right now. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, talking with friends. I'm just doing so much reaching out to people and having phone conversations on a regular basis and video chats when that feels like something I'm up for, and checking in with people more regularly than I'm normally inclined to, so that we can each hear each other and hold space for each other and feel like we're still in community and in relationship has been really important too. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely figuring out new ways to connect.
Yeah.
And this was not a question on the list, but it just came to me based on what you said. So I hope it's okay if I ask it. It's about connection. Okay. And I'm wondering what you have noticed, like what has shifted in your perspective about connection or disconnection as this pandemic has.
Well, so in like speaking personally, and I'll like lean into a bit more vulnerability, which I was preparing to do, so it's good. I was in a long-term relationship that was really socially isolated for like 8.5 years. We just lived together. We worked from home together. We didn't have friends. We didn't have community. It was a really toxic, honestly, relationship and environment. And on some level, leaving that relationship, or one of the many reasons why I left that relationship, was because I was ready for community, and my partner, I think, felt threatened by that. And so I've worked so hard to cultivate community, and I live alone. And I work from home alone. So a big part of keeping myself connected and nourished by friendship has been making social plans out of my apartment. And to remove that from my life and from my self-care has been really challenging. And it's, I think a lot of us are experiencing trauma activation, and I certainly am in many different ways. And one of those is that feeling of being isolated again, and feeling disconnected from support, and from friendship, and from love and belonging, and all the things that we all crave as humans. And I think that's a big part of why, like, I'm on the phone as much as I am lately. Or like last weekend, we did a happy hour date with two of my friends, and that was really sweet. It was also very awkward, like connecting digitally is not the same, and we weren't using Zoom, we were using Skype, and it was very glitchy, and I felt the distance and the disconnection that is so easy for us to all feel right now. And I feel like I'm losing sight a bit of your original question, but though I know I'm answering it in some form. But yeah, it's for me personally, reminding myself that I'm not in this alone, and that there are people out there who I am in a relationship with, and then staying tethered to that relationship helps me stay present and not in the like history of my experiences. But that's an ongoing practice as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing what you did and that part of your story, and leaning into that vulnerability. I appreciate you, and appreciate you sharing that with us. And we were talking about grief and connection, that question, and I am, as you know, because we do work together, I think about grief a lot, and collective grief, and making space for us to grieve as a community and collective. And so I'm curious to know why you feel like it might be important for us to acknowledge grief, like as a collective.
I think so many of us are conditioned by people in our lives and by dominant culture to not feel our feelings, right? And grief is such a human experience and such a natural thing for all of us to feel in a whole variety of different ways. I think in like this like linear, like almost elementary perspective of it, it's like we associate it with us losing someone from our lives, and yet the experience of grief is so much more complex and nuanced than that. And if we're not allowing ourselves space to lean into grief in all of its forms, then we're cutting ourselves off from something that's so human and so important and core to our experience emotionally, psychospiritually, and then we're cutting ourselves off from other things that come from the potential of feeling that, right? Like joy. I think the two do go hand in hand, even though we're not taught to conceptualize our emotional experience in that way. And I think that, for example, in this context, the grief that some of us might be experiencing about not having our social plans or plans that we had on our calendar that we were looking forward to, trips, or, all the things that bring us joy, to allow ourselves to hold space for grief around that. We're also allowing ourselves to recognize how lucky we are to have had those plans, to anticipate that we likely will have them again, though they may not look the same, because we can't predict what the future is going to look like anymore. Mm-hmm. But it feels like to give ourselves space to feel the sadness and the loss also gives ourselves space to feel appreciation and gratitude for all that we do get to experience. And again, I can't have that conversation without also naming the ways in which, like, I'll speak from my own experience, like my privilege is just so visible to me at this point in time. Like, yes, my plans to attend a race equity training were canceled, and I'm disappointed about that. And I don't get to move along the path that I was envisioning for myself this year at the same rate. And yet I am just so fortunate. Like, I love my home, for example. I just keep thinking over and over again, like, I love my home. I am so lucky that if I have to be stuck somewhere by myself for an extended period of time, that I enjoy being in my space. So again, it just feels like I have to allow myself to hold space for the grief so that I can also hold space for the joy, mm-hmm. and the gratitude and the abundance that I feel and that I experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the two are connected, and I think you're right that at least I wasn't conditioned to think about joy and grief going hand in hand, right? it's only through the experience of grief that I realized grief and joy go hand in hand. So I think that's what it was for me. And I, since you mentioned privilege and you mentioned that at the beginning and sharing about your work in the world, I feel like there's a narrative that dominant culture is perpetuating about this virus because all of us are deeply impacted by it, right? And that we're in this together, and this virus, anyone could contract it, which is true. And yet I know we're having very different experiences. And so I just wonder if you could share some about, you just did, but like if there's more you want to share about that.
Yeah, you know, it's the thing I keep thinking of, I mean, first of all, I want to name the fact that the people who are most vulnerable to contracting this virus are Black and brown people, are houseless people, people who struggle with mental health issues that aren't being untreated, et cetera, et cetera. So like, that's very real. And the thing that I am reflecting on a lot lately is right before it, and you know this, and right before it became a very present issue in this country, I was in Italy and with my father on a trip that we had been planning for years, and his health is a constant concern. He has Crohn's disease and various other challenges. And when we were in Italy and learned that Milan was being quarantined, we became very vigilant of the news and realized that the rest of the country in Italy might also experience some degree of quarantine very quickly, and that the situation was escalating quite quickly. And so we woke up one morning and literally decided that day to leave and buy a ticket at whatever cost to come home. And all I kept thinking was, this is a privilege. Like, to be able to wake up and decide to leave Italy and fly back to the country and be able to spend money on something to protect our health and our safety and to look out for my father's well-being. That was just, you know, not everybody has access to that. And it's so apparent to me. And it's so apparent to me too, walking around my neighborhood right now. You know, I live in like an inner part of Portland, and there's a lot of houseless folks around, and they set up tents and camps, and they're still setting up tents and camps, and they're more vulnerable. And my dog and I go for walks, and I have to walk further around them than I normally would because of the circumstances. And that feels so complex and dark for me, to acknowledge that like this person who's sleeping on the street is someone that I have to go out of my way to distance myself from. It just feels even like it almost brings up this feeling that like I'm doing this to the reality when I know inwardly I'm not, but the physical action seems to display that I'm not going to notice them, that I'm going to ignore them. It's a really complex time. I'm just so aware that, I'm quarantined in my home, and I likely will be healthy through this. And most people that I know will probably be healthy through this. And the people who are suffering the most are the ones that I am not in relationship with, that I don't see. And generally speaking, and that's a really scary thing to think of, because I think especially a lot of us think that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and that's part of privilege too. And I was just talking about this yesterday with a friend, that in Portland, it almost feels like people are starting to get a little bit more casual. Like, it's not as bad as we thought it would be. It's mid-April. They said it was going to peak in mid-April. It seems like everything's fine. Let's stop wearing masks, or let's walk closer to each other. And the attitude and the energy is shifting. And that feels scary too, because that feels like a privileged thing to be experiencing or believing, because that's not the reality for most people. Hi, Jasper.
Just Jasper. He agrees with you.
I'm sure that he does. Anyways, it's a complex thing and hard to,
You shared so much. I mean, so many powerful things. And what you just said. And when you talked about the people that you're having to distance from even more, who are potentially houseless, right? Or, I mean, I lived in Portland for a year and noticed a lot of people who did not have homes or who were houseless, experiencing homelessness. And that you have to like distance even more, and that you're naming the conditioning, which is to not even see the folks who are having a different experience than you, right? And I think you are, part of what it sounds like your practice is to notice that, like where you're disconnecting, how you're disconnecting, how culture's asking you to disconnect from people that are having a different experience. So I think that's a tool and a practice that people could definitely employ at this time.
Yeah.
How is your dad? I was thinking, I've been thinking about him for a lot, I mean, months now, right? Like,
Thank you. I've been thinking about your mom too, by the way.
Yeah.
He's good. He's very, very strict about how often he's going to the grocery store and not letting people onto his property or into his home. He's taking a lot of precautions. He's cleaning all the groceries when he brings them through the door. He's leaving, everything outside that doesn't need to be inside. He's being very careful. He can't afford to get this. He is definitely vulnerable. But he's good. Largely speaking, he's good. And he usually lives alone and in some degree of social distancing anyways. So this is familiar for him, and he's not emotionally, psychologically affected in that way, like so many of us are. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad that he is
Thank you.
taking care of himself, and that he is okay at this
you.
time, at least related to COVID, that he's taking care of himself.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So my next question, and it actually, I think it's just a transition from asking about your father, is about losses you've experienced because of COVID-19, or losses you're acutely aware of, like maybe you haven't experienced them, but we've been talking about that, right? What you're noticing, the disconnection, or the awareness that Black and Brown people are being deeply affected by this more and dying first. And so are there losses that you've experienced because of COVID-19?
I don't know that I feel like I have experienced true losses because of COVID-19. Like certainly I've lost some of the things I've already named, like having a sense of in-person community. And I miss my in-person group yoga practice a lot, that moving and breathing and co-regulating with other people, and has been a really important component for me in my life and healing and spiritual practice. And so I miss that, and that is a loss, and then I'm like, am I cutting myself off from feeling that as a loss? That's possible. But when I'm asked that question, I feel like, relatively speaking, I'm not experiencing losses, really. I'm missing parts of my life, but I don't know that I would call those losses. The grief for me that's emerging is more collective, and on behalf of like the systemic inequities and the systemic structures that are, and the people in power who on the day-to-day basis are saying and doing things that feel so wrong and harmful and toxic, and just like, I feel grief related to that. And I feel a lot of grief emerging related to my past experience of living in isolation with one other person and feeling separated from any sense of community or support. Like that grief keeps emerging. I don't know that I feel loss in the way that I think many others are probably experiencing loss. And I think about what might be happening in New York and what they're witnessing. And I'm not having that experience here in Portland, at least not right now. Obviously things could shift in unexpected ways, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I've been thinking a lot about New York too. And I don't necessarily have people there. I did before. And just like, I'm in North Carolina in Winston-Salem, and we've been affected, but not nearly as much as some other areas of the country, and just what it must be like to be in a space where, I mean, over 10,000 people have died from this virus.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't know how many people are have contracted it at this point there in New York, but
Yeah.
it's huge.
It does.
I don't even, my heart and mind don't really even know what to do with with that.
Same.
And it's weird that that's going on, and I'm like sitting here talking to you, you know, it's like, and I'm recording a conversation about grief. It's like,
exactly.
What? But that's
like,
always true.
I know. It almost feels like we're talking around this thing that's happening, that like it's happening to other people. It's happening to us in a different way. And we have to acknowledge that it is happening to other people in a really serious way. And it like that, it could be us, right? It's impossible to know what the coming weeks and months are going to look like. And yeah, but it does feel like we're talking around this thing that we're not actually part of, and it's just impacting us differently, which is true and it's not true, right?
Right. Yeah. And that it's always true. It's like, as we know, inequities are being exposed that have always been now, right? And there's a way, like, I mean, I'm a Black woman and experiencing racism, but then I have privilege in other ways. And so I can like navigate my life based on other identities besides race, and I'm a woman as well. While people are experiencing other forms of oppression, and I don't necessarily have to think about them, although I'm in a practice of doing that.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Life is like that. It's like I can be doing this and someone's experiencing deep pain and inequity and injustice at the same time.
Yeah, it's hard for me, and I have a hard time doing it for myself, but especially when I'm hearing other people, especially people in my community who are white and who, for example, you know, a family member was complaining about the stress of going to the grocery store. And I know for a fact that this person is going to a Whole Foods in a very affluent area. And, you know, of course, I'm sorry that they're experiencing stress and anxiety in that experience. And also, you're experiencing stress and anxiety going to a Whole Foods. You know what I mean? Like, I know that that is a real experience, and I don't want to discount it. And it's also a quite privileged experience and quite removed from the reality of what many others are experiencing, which is a complete 180 from what it's like to experience stress and anxiety grocery shopping. You know, like that's the least of their concern. They might not even have access to that. So yeah.
Yeah, what you just shared made me think. I interviewed someone on Tuesday for this series of conversations, and her sister has been judging her for going to the grocery store a lot. And the reason she's going to the grocery store, and she shares this in her interview, so I'm not sharing anything she hasn't shared. The reason she's going to the grocery store a lot is because she doesn't have a lot of income. So it's like she goes when she has money and can get groceries, and then has to wait, and then goes again. And it just, I mean, I hadn't thought about that, right? Like I hadn't thought about, you know, because we're supposed to be sheltering in place, but what about the people who actually have to go get groceries every other day because they get paid in that way, or they're waiting to get money? So it was just like helpful. It's been continually helpful to broaden my perspective about what is happening and how people are experiencing this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. It never occurred to me that people might have to go to the grocery store multiple times a week. Yeah. And then it is a privilege for me to have waited 2 weeks to go, you know, I mean, I'm realizing also that there are people who have to work at the grocery stores, right? And they're like at risk, you know, exponentially at risk. And it's just, it's so scary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is for sure. Well, my last question, unless there's something else you want to share, which I'm open to, is you shared some about the practices and how you're allowing your grief to move through as this pandemic's unfolding. And I wonder if there are other rituals or practices you want to name, because I think in naming them, other people might find them helpful and supportive. If anything else comes to mind.
Yeah. I'm, as part of my like morning meditation, I'm also really into right now pulling a tarot card a day, and letting that guide me. And I feel like I'm much more connected to that practice than I was before COVID. Like I'm in need of that kind of support and guidance, and that opportunity to kind of zoom out and reflect in a different kind of way when I engage with a tarot card is really helpful right now. It's so easy to just like stay fixated on, like I've been fixated on work in a whole new way. So the tarot practice feels like another reminder that there's more to experience and feel and think about. And it's helpful too for me to do a little bit of journaling, a little around the tarot card, whether that's in the morning or throughout the day or again at night, like just staying kind of connected and tethered to what that message had to say and how it unfolds throughout the day. And I've been doing a lot of like loud music, nighttime dancing, and that has been really helpful too. That just kind of, and it's, you know, I feel it as another opportunity to move the energy and the emotional potential stagnation, and that has been really helpful. And that kind of reminder that like freedom is there, like embodied, you know. And I've been, you know this, I've been dating someone since the beginning of the year, and he has a prayer practice, and that has been something that has been really special to share with him. I am not someone who's ever had a relationship to prayer outside of my, you know, growing up in Judaism, which was not something that greatly resonated with me. And so since leaving, I would say leaving, but since no longer practicing Jewish practices, I have been really disconnected from prayer of any kind. And to be a part of his prayer practice has been really special in so many ways, but especially amidst COVID. Like I feel a lot of emotion emerge in that kind of ceremony space. And I often feel a lot of tears and gratitude, and it's just been another really helpful tool. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds really healing.
Yeah,
that practice.
Yeah.
And to do that with someone, right? To share that practice with someone else at a time where we're having to be so isolated from other people, physically, at least intimately in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you pull a tarot card this morning?
I did. I'm using right now a lot the Animal Spirit Kim Kranz deck. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, I haven't.
Okay, I figured you would. I pulled the Tarantula card, which was the second time this week that I've pulled that card, and felt really appropriate for today when thinking about this interview too, because it seems to me to say so much about following your intuition and leaning in and not overthinking. And when I was thinking about having this conversation, it was really easy for me to like strategize about what I would say. And the card felt like another invitation and reminder that I didn't need to strategize, and that I could just trust that whatever would emerge in our conversation and through your questions and my responses would be just wonderful as they were, rather than trying to control, you know? Yeah. But sometimes I'm pulling cards and I'm thinking on behalf of the collective. And sometimes I'm thinking very personally and individually. And today it felt like more of a personal pull. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever pulled the Tarantula.
I really don't know that I had before this week, and it's been twice this week, which is really fascinating. And it's also fascinating too to witness my reaction, like, oh, Tarantula, that must be bad, you know? And I just love the way she's designed that deck to kind of rewrite those associations and narratives for us.
Yeah. I love that deck too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for, again, for saying yes to this conversation, and just for everything you've shared in this, our time together. And I appreciate you and what you bring to the world, and appreciate your vulnerability. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for all of this.
You are your beating heart, already cracked open, wide open. So